Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Tinnitus, Understanding Causes and Exploring Treatment Options. Hi, I'm Bridgitte Harley, Director and Lead Clinical Audiologist here at the Hearing Clinic. Thank you very much for taking some time out of your evening to join us tonight. Today marks the start of Tinnitus Awareness Week. Each year in February in the UK, we have Tinnitus Awareness Week. And each year there is a new theme. And in 2026, the theme is live music and tinnitus. Following extensive surveying carried out over the summer, which so many people across the music-loving community generously responded to, Tinnitus Week 2026 will be centered on live music and tinnitus. Tinnitus UK has gathered insights from across the music world, from industry professionals and gigging artists to dedicated fans and festival goers to shape a major industry-wide campaign on hearing health and safer listening. Throughout this week, a range of activities will spotlight the connection between tinnitus, hearing wellness, and live music. Highlights include the launch of new research at the House of Lords, alongside a memorable concert at London's iconic Union Chapel, plus extended services, resources, and awareness-raising initiatives. This webinar is our contribution to Tinnitus Awareness Week. So today, Candice and I will be doing this webinar together. We will start off by understanding the auditory system and the common causes of tinnitus. Next, we will understand what is actually happening in your brain and what we can do to calm it. We will look at some effective treatment options and explore the next steps that you may wish to take in better managing your tinnitus. We will be focusing the talk across these 4 studies. These are studies that have been carried out in approximately the last 12 months. And we will be exploring the theory of tinnitus and tinnitus management under the umbrellas of this research. So the first paper is Tinnitus Risk Factors and its Evolution over Time. Neural Mechanisms of Tinnitus, an exploration from the perspective of varying severity levels, which was published in Brain Research Bulletin. We will also look at this paper, Continuous Improvement of Chronic Tinnitus through a 9-month smartphone-based cognitive behavioral therapy randomized control trial. And finally, Predictors of Tinnitus Symptom Relief with Hearing Aids in a European multi-center study. We are able to email these articles over to you if you are interested. I'm now going to hand over to Candice.
Hi everyone, I'm Candice, Senior Clinical Audiologist and Tinnitus Lead at the Hearing Clinic. Thank you so much for joining our webinar tonight, and I hope you enjoy it and learn something new about tinnitus and tinnitus management. So in order to understand tinnitus, we first need to understand the auditory system. On the screen here, we can see an image of the ear and the brain. Because we don't hear in the ear, we hear in the brain. The ear has 3 parts: the outer ear, the middle ear, and the inner ear. And how we hear is sound waves enter the outer ear canal. They vibrate the eardrum, and these little vibrations move over the articular chain in the middle part of the ear. These little vibrations arrive at the cochlea, and they're converted into electrical signals. These signals travel up the hearing nerve to the language centers of the brain where we make sense of sound. So what is tinnitus? Tinnitus is the perception of a sound without an external sound source. It's a signal created by the brain, and it's prevalent in about 14% of adults in the UK. It's often described as a ringing, buzzing, hissing, or whistling sound. It can be heard in one ear, in both ears, or it can be central and heard in the head. Tinnitus can also be somatosensory, which means it's caused by physical tensions within the jaw or the neck, for example. Tinnitus can also be persistent, which means it's there all the time, or it can be intermittent, which means it can come and go. So what causes tinnitus? A 2025 study titled Tinnitus Risk Factors and Its Evolution Over Time found that the main risk factor for developing tinnitus is hearing loss. So when tiny sensory hair cells in the cochlea fail to convert these sound waves into electrical signals, and this can be due to natural wear and tear, noise exposure, your genetics, medication, or medical history, the hearing brain only receives a portion of the sound signal. And in order to compensate for the reduced auditory input from the ears, the brain turns up its own volume switch. We call this central gain. This results in an increase in activity in the auditory system. And this hyperactivity results in the brain creating a sound called tinnitus. But hearing alone, or hearing loss alone, does not explain tinnitus distress. So what causes severe tinnitus and tinnitus-related distress? Now, 14% of adults in the UK experience tinnitus. However, only 1 to 3% of this 14% are distressed by it. So that means that the majority of people who have tinnitus can often forget about it and will only hear it when they're reminded about it. So why is it that some people experience significant distress, but others don't? The study further investigates what predicts severe tinnitus, and it was found that tinnitus severity was strongly linked to stress, mood, poor sleep, or individual personality traits. So hearing loss predicts where the tinnitus appears, but emotional and sleep systems predict how distressing tinnitus becomes. So for those of you who have tinnitus, you'll know that when you're tired or stressed, your tinnitus becomes much more noticeable, distracting, or distressing. So what is happening in the brain for people who experience distressing tinnitus? Well, the brain has an emotional alarm system, which triggers a vicious cycle. You notice tinnitus, the brain reacts with fear or stress. And when we're stressed, the body switches on its stress system. This releases stress hormones like cortisol or adrenaline and puts us into a fight or flight state. Our heart rate goes up and the nervous system becomes more alert. Over time, if stress is ongoing, this system becomes sensitized. And so that means that the brain has a much lower threshold for noticing and reacting to tinnitus. At the same time, the brain's threat system, comprised of structures like the amygdala, hippocampus, the insula, labels tinnitus as a danger. So sound becomes linked with emotions like anxiety and worry, and the brain basically learns this sound is important and it's threatening. So what happens next is attention gets pulled towards the sound, the auditory system becomes more sensitive, and the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that focuses and monitors, keeps checking in on the tinnitus. So the more stressed and anxious someone is, the more the brain listens for the sound and the louder and more constant it feels. So to summarize, stress causes the brain to treat tinnitus as a threat. Your attention locks onto it, and that creates a loop where tinnitus feels stronger and harder to ignore. There are two images here on the screen. The first shows the primary auditory cortex, our hearing center in the brain, And the second image shows the emotional centers in the brain, and it comprises of structures like the hippocampus, the amygdala, the thalamus, etc. In cases of mild tinnitus, the hearing center becomes hyperactive. In cases of severe tinnitus, the whole emotional brain is engaged and active, along with the hearing center. So in the study titled Neural Mechanisms of Tinnitus, an exploration from the perspective of varying severity levels, the researchers wanted to understand why tinnitus becomes more distressing for some people than others, and they do this by comparing brain activity. There were three key findings from the study. The first key finding is that tinnitus is a whole brain condition. The study found that in people with severe tinnitus, brain scans showed increased activity, not only in hearing areas, but also in parts of the brain responsible for hearing, integrating senses, visual processing, thinking, attention, and control. This confirms severe tinnitus is not just an ear problem, it involves the whole brain. The study also showed different brain patterns depending on severity. In mild tinnitus, the brain can still adapt and dampen the signal. But in cases of severe tinnitus, the brain's control system becomes overworked and less effective, especially when hearing centers are overactive. And this is usually triggered by hearing changes or hearing loss. And the control centers initially quieten, but then they become overstimulated. And this strongly explains why people with severe tinnitus fail to habituate to the sound, or this idea of failed habituation. The second key finding is that the emotional brain network plays a major role. So in more distressing tinnitus, it is found that there is a stronger communication between the hearing centers, the emotional regulation areas, and the cognitive control areas. Emotional regulation areas are linked to stress and anxiety, and the cognitive control areas are linked to attention and monitoring. And these connections were closely linked to anxiety, low mood, or poor sleep. And so what we understand is that the more distressed someone feels by their tinnitus, the more the emotional brain becomes involved. The third key finding is tinnitus distress is closely linked to emotion and sleep. And in severe cases of tinnitus, anxiety and depression were linked to changes in emotional processing areas and frontal control regions, and sleep problems were linked to changes in hearing centers and multisensory brain areas. And in summary, emotional distress and sleep problems are not side effects, they are core parts of severe tinnitus. So just to recap and check that everyone is still awake, tinnitus is about hyperactivity in the neural circuits in the brain. Non-distressing tinnitus is due to hyperactivity, which is contained within the auditory centers in the brain. Distressing tinnitus involves hyperactivity of both hearing centers and the emotional regulation centers in the brain. The management strategies that we're going to discuss will focus on reducing hyperactivity in the brain across the auditory centers, emotional regulation centers, and the central nervous system. The first management strategy we're going to discuss is neuromodulation, and early studies are showing promising results. The study is titled Neuromodulation for Treatment of Tinnitus, a Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis. So what is neuromodulation? Neuromodulation is the use of gentle electrical or magnetic stimulation of brain or nerves, which aims to reduce hyperactivity in the central nervous system. Neuromodulation can reduce how distressing tinnitus feels by changing brain activity. The study looked at whether different types of neuromodulation work better than placebo. So it was a large systematic review of and meta-analysis of 19 high-quality clinical trials involving 1,186 people with tinnitus. They studied 3 different types of neuromodulation. The first, repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation. The second, transcranial direct current stimulation. And the third is transcutaneous electrical nerve stimulation. And there were 4 key findings in the study. The first key finding is that neuromodulation can reduce tinnitus distress. Across the studies, people receiving neuromodulation had significant reduction in tinnitus distress. People receiving the placebo treatment did not show meaningful improvement. So this suggests that the benefits were not just placebo. The second key finding is that different methods of neuromodulation work at different times. So 2 methods of neuromodulation, which would be transcutaneous electrical nerve stimulation and transcranial direct current stimulation, showed strong improvements for short-term benefits within the first few weeks. The repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation showed sustained improvement over time or over months. So what we understand from that is that no single method worked perfectly for everyone, but a combination of the neuromodulation techniques showed a significant clinical benefit. The third key finding was that neuromodulation doesn't only help tinnitus, but it helps mood as well. Transcranial direct current stimulation led to a significant reduction in depression scores on the questionnaires. There was some reduction in anxiety, and this supports the idea that tinnitus is closely linked to the emotional brain system. The last key finding is that it's generally safe, and across all the studies, there were no serious side effects. Mild effects included headaches, dizziness, facial twitching, but overall, neuromodulation appears to be safe and well tolerated. So there's really good evidence that gently stimulating the brain can reduce tinnitus distress, which supports the idea that tinnitus lives in the brain networks, not just the ears. There is a neuromodulation device approved for use in the UK, and the company is called Linear, and the link is on the slide here if you want to learn a little bit more. Right, so on to this management strategy, which is very important, correcting hearing changes. So if hearing loss is the main predictor for tinnitus, the primary step to tinnitus management is to correct hearing changes. The study called or titled Predictors of Tinnitus Symptom Relief with Hearing Aids in a European Multi-Center Study aimed to determine whether 1, hearing aid usage improves tinnitus-related distress and tinnitus loudness, and if so, whether tinnitus frequency, degree of hearing loss, hearing aid use time, the accuracy of the hearing aid fitting influence this effect. The study found that 6 weeks of hearing aid usage resulted in clinically significantly reduced tinnitus-related distress, irrespective of tinnitus attributes, audiological characteristics, or sound processing parameters that were tested. This finding underlies the benefit of hearing aids for individuals suffering from chronic tinnitus and mild to moderate hearing loss. And it provides support for the clinical decision of recommending hearing aids in this population. But what happens if your audiologist tells you that your hearing is normal? So we know that the vast majority of tinnitus patients likely have some level of hearing change, measurable or not. Standard audiograms don't capture the full picture. The audiogram is the beep test that some of you may have had already, and the beep test tests pure tone thresholds at limited frequencies. And research shows that subclinical hearing changes or damage often go undetected by the beep test. So just because the audiogram shows normal hearing, it doesn't mean that our hearing is perfect. This is why we use additional diagnostic testing in our tinnitus assessments like otoacoustic emissions, and they can pick up on hearing loss where the audiogram can't. In these cases, we fit mild amplification hearing devices to people with normal hearing and distressing tinnitus. So now, with distressing tinnitus, after we've managed the hearing loss, we must then manage the emotional and attention systems. So let's talk about hacking the emotional centers in the brain. We have strong research showing that when we calm the emotional centers of the brain, tinnitus distress reduces, and even if the sound doesn't disappear completely. The goal of tinnitus management is not to fight the tinnitus, it's to teach the brain that tinnitus is safe. And the key tools that we use to accomplish this are cognitive behavioral therapy for tinnitus, relaxation and breathing techniques, sound therapy, sleep support, and reducing overall stress load. So for the purpose of today's webinar, we're going to focus on cognitive behavioral therapy, and this model was developed by Aaron Beck, and it explains that thoughts, emotions, and behaviors are all connected. A sound becomes distressing when negative thoughts trigger strong emotions and unhelpful behaviors. So people who experience distressing tinnitus enter into a negative tinnitus loop or vicious cycle. So what will happen is you'll notice the tinnitus. You then start to begin to think negative automatic thoughts and feel negative emotions like, this is terrible, how am I going to cope? Is this dangerous? Is something wrong? And these thoughts create anxiety. The brain then focuses on the sound, and we go into the monitoring phase. And here the sound feels louder and more intrusive. And as the sound becomes louder and more intrusive, the negative automatic thoughts continue. And these in turn result in higher anxiety and increase monitoring of the tinnitus. And so here we find ourselves in this never-ending vicious cycle, and we can call this a fear avoidance cycle. So cognitive behavioral therapy helps by breaking this vicious cycle. The first way it can help is by cognitive restructuring. So here we challenge those negative automatic thoughts and change them to more neutral thinking patterns. It can also break the cycle by changing your behaviors. So this works to reduce your avoidances and reduce your monitoring. And lastly, CBT helps by targeting the emotional distress. So once we break that vicious cycle, we can start to habituate to the tinnitus, and the tinnitus can start to sink into the background. So here at the Hearing Clinic, we offer in-person CBT sessions. However, treatment can also be accessed through modern technology like app-based CBT programs. And in the study titled Continuous Improvement of Chronic Tinnitus Through a 9-Month Smartphone-Based CBT, it was a randomized control trial, investigates the outcomes of a 9-month smartphone-based CBT for patients with tinnitus. It was a clinical trial of 187 patients using CBT, and it showed evidence of statistically significant, clinically relevant, and continuous benefit of an app-based CBT intervention in patients with chronic tinnitus, with the most significant improvements in severe tinnitus, and we also saw a reduction in anxiety, stress, and low mood. It's really important to note that CBT does not remove the sound, but it changes how the brain responds to it. So to summarize, when you notice your tinnitus, what's driving it are hearing changes. When tinnitus becomes distressing, what's driving it is the emotional brain and sleep become involved. And when tinnitus improves, it's because hearing is corrected and we reduce the stress by retraining the brain. So to begin your tinnitus management journey at the Hearing Clinic, we would start with a 2-hour tinnitus assessment. It includes an in-depth case history interview where we'll explore your hearing, your stress, and your tinnitus experience and distress. We'll complete a quantitative questionnaire, it's called the Tinnitus Functional Index, to further understand the impact that tinnitus is having in your life. Other relevant questionnaires can be performed as required, and these are usually to investigate any other sound sensitivities or sound annoyances that you may have. We then complete a comprehensive diagnostic hearing assessment, and this will include video otoscopy, tympanometry, pure tone audiometry, the beep test, speech testing to understand more about how your brain is hearing, and of course, otoacoustic emission testing to detect those subtle changes which perhaps cannot be detected on the beep test. We then spend the last 30 minutes of this appointment looking through your results and recommendations, and here we will create an individualized management plan and put that in place for you. And of course, you'll receive a copy of your results and your report will be sent to you and your GP. Bridgitte, you're still on mute.
Thank you. There we go. Thank you, Candice. So we just want to share this lovely feedback that we had from a patient, and I think this beautifully captures their experience and what we hope to give our patients. I just wanted to send an email of thanks to the Hearing Clinic and in particular Candice Green, with whom I had an appointment sometime in December. After first experiencing tinnitus in October, I had a very difficult few months where, at its worst, I was averaging fewer than 2 hours sleep a night, and it was a constant distraction during the day. I would say I was starting to manage it a bit better before meeting with Candice in December, but still had reservations over whether I was doing the right thing, which essentially revolved around allowing myself to hear the tinnitus rather than trying to distract myself or using white noise, etc. The appointment was hugely valuable, not just for the abundance of tests that were undertaken, but more for the measured and informed responses that Candice provided to all my questions. I went away from that appointment feeling like a weight had been lifted and I had a very clear way forward. I do still hear the ringing. Sometimes it'll break into consciousness during the day, and I'll often hear it at night. But it's forgettable, and it does not bother me when I do hear it. The appointment with Candice and Radlett in December was a massive step forward on the road to acceptance of the ear ringing, which in itself has subdued to near irrelevance. I will certainly remember my experience with the Hearing Clinic, and if I ever have any hearing problems in the future, or if I have any family members or friends who need similar assistance, I will know where to turn.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Bridgitte. It's really wonderful to hear such positive feedback. And of course, it makes our job very, very rewarding. So I wanted to finish with something that's really important. What we know from both research and clinical experience is that tinnitus can become less noticeable. It can be less emotional and much less controlling. The sound itself isn't the real problem. The real problem is when the brain stays in threat mode, constantly monitoring, reacting, staying on high alert. But the good news is that the brain is adaptable. It can learn to let tinnitus fade into the background, just like it does with so many other sounds in our lives. So with the right support, like hearing technology, sound therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, neuromodulation, or a combination approach, most people reach a point where tinnitus no longer runs their life. And I wanted to leave you with the message tonight, which is that tinnitus is manageable. You don't have to navigate it on your own, and we are here to help. So to support Tinnitus Awareness Week, we'd like to offer you a special opportunity. We usually charge £295 for our comprehensive tinnitus assessment and management plan, but webinar attendees can book for a special rate of £235. So if you'd like to book, please email our admin team and just mention that you attended the webinar. And you can email them on hello@thehearingclinic.co.uk. That's over here. Sorry, Bridget, still on mute.
So thank you very much, everyone, for your time this evening. We will now open up the floor to some questions and answers. But before we dive into that, there's just one more slide to share with you, which is the annual tinnitus report, which was published yesterday. This is Dr. Hashir Oz. He is the director of Hashir International Specialist Clinics and Research Institute for Misophonia, Tinnitus and Hyperacusis. He is based in Guildford. He has trained and supervised over 1,000 audiologists and psychologists in his international tinnitus masterclasses. He's published over 50 research papers in the field of audiology. He is Honorary Hearing Research Consultant at the Royal Surrey NHS Foundation Trust and has served as Managing Editor of the journal Noise and Health and Associate Editor for the International Journal of Audiology. So he has taken all the research in 2025 and grouped it into different themes, and he summarized his research in this paper. You can find a link to this document on his website, and it's a very great read and will cover almost everything that you're still curious about that we may have not had time to cover this evening. So I'm just going to see if we can open up the Q&A if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask. Okay. Okay, so we have a question here. I currently use a Flow T DCS device for mild to moderate depression with good effect. Might this also help for tinnitus treatment? So this may certainly have an impact on the salience of tinnitus and the awareness of tinnitus, as if we are having a treatment to reduce depression in the brain, we will therefore have a cross-network, hopefully a cross-network effect for managing the emotional response that we have to tinnitus. Candice, would you like to comment on that?
I think you answered that wonderfully. It's definitely something that we can hope for, is to see that cross benefit across all networks of the brain. But I think just as based on the webinar content, sometimes a combination approach is very helpful. And so it might be nice to engage in a little bit of CBT as well, or other methods to supplement.
Okay. Is the recording going to be available for catch-up? I think there will be a recording available for catch-up. Okay. Are there any more questions that people would like to put forward? Okay, I see someone has their hand up. Let me just see if I can. Okay. All right, John, I've allowed your microphone if you'd like to ask your question. John, if you'd like to ask your question, I think if you could pop your microphone off mute. I have allowed your microphone for your question, unless you wish to type it in the Q&A section at the top.
That's sorry. Found the control. Yeah, have you come across any link between tinnitus and dizziness and vertigo at all in the material that you've been discussing tonight? Because I have had tinnitus, and I'm pleased to relate that I would agree with you. Since I've been wearing hearing aids, the impact on me day to day has been much reduced, but I'm still getting occasional bouts of vertigo and sort of loss of balance. So I just wondered whether there was anything in the research that that linked that with tinnitus, or whether they were two completely separate issues.
So when we look at the ear, the peripheral auditory system, the cochlea is the hearing part, and the vestibular system is the balance organ, and they're neighbors and share a common structure just within the skull over here. And sometimes we will have something that is having a common effect across both the hearing mechanism and the balance system. So there may be a common cause that manifests in both the hearing organ with some changes to hearing, but also manifests within the balance organ, causing some changes to balance and being able to navigate, particularly when one is in movement or moving the head in various planes. So yes, there can be a common underlying cause for both. Candice, anything you want to add there? Okay, thank you, John.
Thank you for that. Thank you.
Okay, so if there's not going to be any more questions, we'll just say thank you very much for your time this evening. Hopefully there was something interesting in there for you. If you'd like any of the papers, we can send those over. One is not for sharing, it's not in the public domain, that's a purchased paper. But otherwise, if you would like to read the summary in Hashir's report, it's very, very well laid out, and it covers all the topics around tinnitus, and it's a very, very interesting read. So thank you very much for your time, and good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.